Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now, featuring Scott Ott, who spent the last, I would say maybe almost 10 days working very hard on his Clint Eastwood impression, and I think he's got it largely down. So I'm going to do the intros and outros for this set of shows, and you'll be able to hear Scott's impression of Mr. Eastwood in just a moment. This show, as you probably know by now, is a pretty simple case of ambush, where Scott has a question. I have no idea what it's going to be, and he's going to ask it, and we're going to answer it as best we can. So, Mr. Eastwood, it's all yours.
So, Bill, by now you're probably asking yourself, do I feel lucky? Well, do you? Punk.
Punk!
Okay. Well, biggest news this week, of course, has been the restarting of the federal government after a 3-week shutdown, longest shutdown or partial shutdown anyway, as they call it, in the history of the government. And right after the deal was announced to start up the government for 3 weeks, after a 25-day shutdown, I should clarify, the right immediately came down with both feet on Donald Trump, including Ann Coulter, who authored a book called In Trump We Trust a year or so ago, slamming President Trump, saying that he caved to Nancy Pelosi by not getting his wall and by allowing the government to restart. Today, as we record this, President Trump has told the Wall Street Journal that he's not really confident, that he thinks it's a less than 50% chance that the Democrats will be able to make a deal that's satisfactory to him between now and the 3-week deadline, and that he may just very well have to go ahead and use some executive action. Bill, does this sound to you like a guy who heard the criticism when the restart happened and is backpedaling, or does it sound like maybe this was the plan all along and he basically is stripping Nancy Pelosi of her excuse?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know where to begin with this, so let's just start at the beginning. It's awful late to be talking about building a wall. The wall was the central campaign promise of the Donald Trump candidacy. And while I am enormously grateful for the fact that ISIS has been smashed and the economy is booming and North Korea understands that they're not playing with kittens anymore and all the rest of these many gains, I simply do wonder why we are speaking about this now that we've lost control of the House of Representatives.
Ann Coulter said he demanded this for 18 months and he lied, is what she's saying now. Well,
Ann is very smart, but Ann tends to move from one position to another pretty quickly. And I'm not saying she's wrong. I'm just saying I'm not ready to go there. But it was certainly, I think, the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, I was very surprised at how slowly this thing was moving. When I say slowly, I mean not at all. Now, before we get too much further in this, I understand that this was the first time, when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, this was the first time that the Republican voter had a chance to see their representatives do what they've been promising to do since 2008. And they didn't do that. They didn't repeal Obamacare. All of these people who've been starting in 2010 when we flipped the House by a big margin, we're going to repeal Obamacare. We're going to have a conservative Republican House, Senate, and presidency. Well, here's the House. 4 years later, here's the Senate. 2 years after that, here's the presidency. And now all of this legislation that's being sent or is presumably needed to get things like the wall done, the Republicans won't vote on them. At least they wouldn't. They've been thrown out of office now, many of them. So this failure is not just a failure of Donald Trump. It's a failure of his supposed Republican majority to make this thing happen. But honestly, Scott, there is a very compelling case to be made for any president, not Donald Trump, just about any president. I would say it's a fair thing to say that even if they do 2 terms, 90% of what they are going to accomplish in terms of legacy happens in the first 100 days of their first term.
So the Congressional Budget Office comes out with a statement today, as we record this on Monday, that the government shutdown for those 25 days cost some $11 billion, $3 billion of which can never be recovered. Larry Kudlow, coming out of the White House spokesman, as a White House spokesman, said it's a drop in the bucket compared to the vast size of the federal budget, and so he kind of downplayed that. Clearly, CBO is supposed to be a nonpartisan entity, but clearly this number is being thrown out there at this point to put pressure on one side or the other to say, look, if you don't make a deal within the next 3 weeks, you already pissed away $11 billion. You're going to waste more. Who do you think that accusation lands on?
I think the best answer to that question is the responsibility for the whole thing rests on the shoulders of 50 or 60 years of Republican and Democratic representatives who have gone to Washington and become so intoxicated by an endless credit card and lacking any sense of moral restraint or decency, have driven us to the point where $5 billion is not worth talking about. It's simply a rounding error. $5 billion is a simple rounding error for a government that spends approximately $3,600 billion a year. We spend $10 billion. The federal government spends $10 billion a day. Rule of thumb, round numbers, $10 billion a day. So if we've been arguing for this wall thing for 25 days now,
yes,
right? Okay, so there's $25 billion of government spending that happened between the beginning and the end of this.
Now, Bill, by the way, the $3 billion that we're not going to get back is the loss of that government productivity that we didn't experience because they weren't
I know.
at work.
Yeah, that's sure. Yeah, well, as you know, Scotty, here's the thing. We'll all be old people in our rocking chairs. We hope someday, maybe in 2050 or 60 or something. And even then, as our brittle bones just force us to try and rock back and forth underneath the surveillance drones, we will look back on the great government shutdown of 2019 with a remembrance of the unbelievable hardship and the cruelty that we endured in our daily lives as a result of the government shutting down.
I'm thinking
I can't
of
even
the
talk
wave
about
of
it.
shutdown babies that have got to be coming 9 months from now.
I can't even talk about it, Scott. It's too near and it's too raw.
So politically,
but you traveled during the government shutdown. You came out here during the government shutdown. You went to LAX, which is infamously slow, maybe not the slowest in the world, or in the country, but infamously slow. You sailed through TSA, right?
I just heard on NPR on the way home today that people, if we go back into another government shutdown, will people be willing to put up with the long lines at the airports? And I thought, well, I don't fly very often, but when I flew to Los Angeles and came out of there, I got dropped off by the Uber guy. I was sitting at my gate in 10 minutes.
So this is the most visible thing that the government does. And as we've said many times before, when there's a government shutdown, it's usually because a Republican is saying is either this is spending too much, usually spending too much, or we need money for this, and the Democrats oppose it in order to keep spending. It doesn't matter who's president and who's not. It doesn't matter who's shutting down and who's not. It's more spending versus slightly less spending. So that's almost always what the shutdown comes to. But it seems to me that this time, as opposed to Obama's government shutdown, or the shutdown that was imposed on him, you could fairly say, I guess, the first thing that happened in that shutdown was they roped off the Lincoln Memorial. They put up police tape around it. They said you cannot go to the Lincoln Memorial because the government is shut down, and we don't have any park rangers here in this big open field of grass with this enormous building with these wide open stairs and no doors, so therefore you can't come and see your monuments. Sorry. And what that is, and I remember stories from back in the day, Scotty, we were talking about stories like this before, where park rangers were taking people out in buses and and making them wait 4 or 5 hours without going to the toilet so they could put some pressure or kind of tighten the screws on the American people. I think as with everything that the left seems to do, the more they do it, the less effective it becomes. Certainly,
I was going to ask you that.
It's certainly true for the race card. So now, a government shutdown. I remember the first one, thinking, "Holy cow! Is it going to be like Y2K?" And turns out, yes, it was exactly as catastrophic as Y2K.
Well, people went a month now. Do you think that that kind of that threat has lost its sting?
Scotty, we don't have a government anymore, and we haven't had one for a long time. How many years did Barack Obama go without the Senate submitting a budget? Was it 4 or 5?
At least.
Okay. So, and I'm not saying the problem began with him, but I think it grew significantly with him. So when the job of the legislature is to produce a budget or approve a budget, and they don't produce a budget, they don't do their fundamental basic job. That, forget all the laws and legislation, all the posturing and all the parties and all the gifts and all the rest of that stuff. Their fundamental bottom level baseline job is to execute the simple commands of running this monstrosity called the U.S. government. And if they ran it without a budget for 6 years, is that a constitutional violation? I guess it's not, or else we would have. Well, who cares, right? Who cares?
Well, the House is supposed to draw it up, the Senate is supposed to approve it, and the President is supposed to sign it.
Or reject it, right?
Yeah, or reject it. Yeah,
and that didn't happen, did it? It just simply didn't appear.
So I guess my question in this, though, is has the Democratic Party overplayed their hand to the extent that, the big threat used to be, the Republicans are shutting down the government. Well, now we've been through a month of a shutdown government, and for most people, all the impact they've really had is hearing over and over on the news that the government was shut down.
Something that needs to be said as well. When I talk about the government, I'm talking about the thing. There are many fine people, many fine people, in fact, virtually all of them that I've run into, who actually work in the government, who are hardworking people, love their country, and are doing essentially a very difficult job as best as they possibly can. Those people have been working now for almost a month without pay, and they should get their back pay. It's not a promise of retirement luxuries in the future. It's like they put in the work, they need to get their back pay. And there's no question they need to get their back pay. So when I talk about the government, I'm not talking about the people that make up the government. Many of them are very fine, some of them are not, just as in the rest of the world. So you're right. The more government shutdowns that we have, the less a government shutdown is going to mean anything. And as I said before, we don't have a government anymore. I can remember very clearly, I want to say in the 80s, was it Gramm-Rudman spending caps? Was that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we can't control our spending. We had a deficit of something incredible, like almost $1 trillion. It's 25 now or something like that. And so we passed legislation that said that these are the limits on how much you can spend. That's it. This is the law. You cannot spend more than this. And the first thing we did was pass executive orders and amendments and so on, and just keep raising the pass Gramm-Rudman, kept going past it and past it and past it. We've got to get here, and one of the reasons we had one of the government shutdowns was because the spending was greater than was allowed by these laws. And then people just ignored them, and they kept spending anyway. And so the whole idea of the limited of using the legal means, the legislature of the United States, to limit the spending of the legislature of the United States, once those limits had been broken as many times as they were broken, they became so irrelevant that we don't even hear the term anymore. I don't think most Americans know what Gramm-Rudman is, but it was legislation designed to stop spending, and they didn't stop spending because they can't, because they're addicts. And you're never ever going to find a cocaine addict who's going to get a whole bunch of cocaine out and going to say, I'll have this now and I'll leave the rest of this till next week. You're never going to find that guy. It doesn't work that way. So the idea of this government doing its fundamental basic duty of managing the actual personnel of the government, doing the things that the government should be doing, plus all of the other thousands of things that it shouldn't be doing, it is not a government anymore. And when you say that, when you look at the budget and you talk, I know we're talking about like $5 billion, but you're looking at $230 billion into social programs, and that's considered sacrosanct. You can't cut that. It's non-discretionary spending. Essentially, we promised it to people. And when you're telling me that the people who have been elected to run this organization called the United States government, when you're telling me that they no longer can control how much money this thing spends, that tells me that no one can control how much money this thing spends. And if no one can control it, then you can't call this a government. You can call yourself a train conductor if you want to sit up by the smokestack and wave a little flag, But if that train's going downhill and you can't stop it, or at least attempt to stop it, if you don't know what lever to pull, you're not a train conductor. You're just a passenger. And that's what these people in Congress are now. They're passengers. And they're passengers who are accelerating this downward plunge as fast as they can. And And as our friend Glenn Reynolds says, that which cannot continue will not continue.
Well, Bill, before you say goodbye here, I just want to say a personal thank you to all the members at BillWhittle.com who this week have reached out and offered prayers and words of support for me on the Bill Whittle Facebook page and elsewhere. It's really been heartwarming. I apologize for being the sole reason why we have been unable to create content for the last week. And this voice that you hear now, this is the first day that I've been able to muster even this much.
Yeah, we had a conference. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, please.
We had a conference call. Scott and I did end of last week, and when I say a conference call, it was a Skype call. I would talk, Scott would nod, shake his head, and then he would type things, and I'd get the response. He was really, really out of it. But that was, I have to tell you, Scotty, I don't know if I told you this already, but I was sick a little while ago, just briefly, the flu or something. Food poisoning, something like that. And you put up a Facebook post explaining that I was out for a while, and you used language which is perfectly good, in fact, excellent language, but it's a little bit archaic. You say, Bill Whittle has fallen ill, and all of a sudden all of the sympathy and all of the respect and the love and the warmth that we get from our people just started flowing.
Yeah.
And just as a matter of revenge, I really seriously gave some thought to putting up a post that said, conservatism has lost one of its most powerful voices today with Scott Ott. And then when people would have done the what they do because they're good people, I'd say, no, he's got laryngitis. He's probably 3-4 days.
Well, the headline that we put on BillWhittle.com was that Scott Ott was struck dumb.
Struck dumb by many things. He's speechless. That'll do it for this edition of Bill Whittle Now, brought to you by the paying members of BillWhittle.com. They make all of the content that comes out of this little workshop of ours, this little bastion of common sense and decency. And if you think the world could use more common sense and decency, we agree with you. And the way to do that is to have more people with common sense and decency go up to sign up to become members over at BillWhittle.com. So for Scott Ott, Bill Whittle, and the rest of the tiny little team here that lifts such heavy burdens with such amazing grace, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.